Letitia James, New York's Attorney General and one of the most powerful black women in American law enforcement, had faced grand juries, Wall Street lawyers, and billion-dollar fraud cases. But nothing, not even the state's most vicious political crossfire, quite prepared her for what happened that evening, in her own backyard, under string lights and jazz. It wasn't a courtroom showdown, it was a neighborhood potluck. And yet, behind every clink of wine glasses and every slice of quiche was a truth far more brutal than any press conference would ever reveal. You see, the confrontation didn't come with subpoenas or microphones. It came with smiles, with fingertips that barely touched, with compliments that cut deeper than insults. And it began the moment the Moreau family crossed her gate. It was a soft summer evening in Brooklyn Heights, the kind where wine breathes easier and old grudges wear perfume. Letitia had opened her home for a rare community gathering. No politics, no cameras, just neighbors. Old friends dropped by with homemade tarts and rhubarb pies. Children darted between folding chairs. A Miles Davis record hummed through the speakers near the hydrangeas, and at the center of it all stood Letitia, composed in a sharp black square-neck dress, hair coiled into a high bun, her AG pin catching the soft light like a badge of earned defiance. She moved through the crowd with grace and steel, offering warm greetings, holding eye contact, her presence unmistakable. She belonged. And then the mood shifted. The back gate creaked open, and in walked the Moreaus, new to the neighborhood, old money from Westchester. Cale Moreau had been mentioned in passing, a young investment executive who'd recently bought the restored brownstone across the street. But it was his family that made the air grow heavier by degrees. Vivienne Moreau entered first, chin slightly lifted, white knit sweater folded with surgical precision over her shoulders. Her handshake with Letitia was more a transaction than a greeting, cool fingertips that recoiled on contact. "Thank you for the invitation," she said with a tight smile. "It's a very interesting setting." Letitia smiled back, the corners of her mouth precise. "I'm glad you could make it." Her tone was cordial, practiced, but her breath shifted ever so slightly. A woman trained to read depositions now read glances, and what she saw in Vivian's gaze wasn't curiosity. It was inventory. Trailing behind was Gerard Moreau, silver-haired, former military by the way he stood. Ramrod posture, suit jacket, buttoned on instinct. And then Camille, their eldest daughter, a crimson-lipped composite of every tailored stereotype. The blazer cinched too tightly, the phone already in hand, the wine glass already half-tilted. Camille's eyes swept the backyard like a real estate broker skimming a property below her client's range. When her gaze landed on Letitia's lapel pin, she leaned in slightly and said, loud enough for a few others to hear, "Oh, you're in government? I just assumed. I don't know, maybe some kind of community organizer. Evanston produces the most fascinating resumes." It wasn't the words that stung. It was the varnish, the velvet on the blade. Letitia didn't flinch. Her response was a masterclass in restraint. "Attorney General," she said, "but I suppose grassroots work builds the best training ground." Camille raised her glass. "Oh, absolutely. Nothing teaches grit like zoning permits and tenant boards." Her laugh was soft, practiced, just enough to suggest humor, just sharp enough to draw blood. Across the patio, conversations continued, but several guests had subtly tuned in. Joanne, the retired schoolteacher from down the block, gave Letitia a glance. Not pity, recognition. Others kept talking, but their eyes flicked toward the exchange like they were reading subtitles in a foreign film they didn't want to admit they understood. Vivienne moved to the buffet table, eyes scanning the spread. "Such a unique menu," she remarked to no one in particular. "Reminds me of a civic gala we attended in Harlem once. Very inclusive." Letitia folded her hands in front of her. This was her home, her event, her community. And yet, in that moment, she was reminded that some people don't need walls to feel ownership. They bring their walls with them, invisible, polished, weaponized. But here's what they didn't know. Letitia didn't host this gathering to impress them. She didn't spend her life rising from Evanston to Albany to earn a footnote in their conversations. She had opened her home to share joy, to build trust, to show her neighborhood something the Moreaus could never buy. Credibility earned in the fire, not inherited from a country club. And if they thought the evening would pass with her folding politely under the weight of their passive aggression, they were about to learn a lesson far more brutal than politics ever taught. Because Letitia James didn't rise to power by blending in. She rose because she never once asked for permission to stand out. It didn't take long for the civility to curdle. Like milk left out just a moment too long, the atmosphere shifted. Quietly, subtly, but unmistakably. Letitia could feel it even before the first jab landed. She was trained for moments like this, not the kind that exploded, but the ones that simmered. The kind where people dress bigotry in silk and call it etiquette. She smiled through conversations with familiar faces, gracious with old neighbors, exchanging nods and laughter. But she could feel the eyes from the Moreau table. Not curious, not admiring, calculating, like auditors reviewing her for unapproved line items, blackness, ambition, power. And then came Camille. Draped on the arm of a well-tanned hedge fund heir in training, she spoke with the volume of someone who's never had to whisper to be heard. "I just really admire people who overcome systemic obstacles," she said, twirling her wine glass as if auditioning for a Chardonnay commercial. "Those diversity scholarship programs really do create some interesting outcomes, don't they?" The last word dropped like a hair in a cocktail, barely visible, but suddenly no one wanted another sip. Letitia didn't turn her head. She didn't need to. Joanne, the retired teacher from down the street, caught the line immediately. She leaned in, hand gently resting on Letitia's wrist. "Ignore her," she whispered, eyes narrowed. "They think they're being clever. They're not. They're just being themselves." That's the thing about old money racism. It never shouts. It insinuates. Camille didn't need to call Letitia lucky or token directly. She just had to coat her condescension in faux liberal admiration, the kind that lets them say, "I voted for Obama," while clutching their pearls when someone like Letitia moves in next door. It's the theater of inclusion. And Camille? She was auditioning hard for Best Supporting Role in a white savior fantasy. But if Camille was the stage performer, Gerard Moreau was the old script. Worn, dated, but still performed in certain circles with smug confidence. He approached with a Cabernet grin and the gait of a man who once served on the board of something he never attended. "I've caught some of your press conferences," he said, swirling his glass like he was trying to age the insult. "Impressive delivery, I must say. Though sometimes I wonder, public interest work, community policy, is it impactful enough if one truly wants to leave a mark?" Letitia pivoted toward him, eyes steady, spine unmoved. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. "I leave a mark," she said evenly, "by protecting those your favorite statutes tend to forget." It was a sentence sharpened like a scalpel, not shouted, not snarled, delivered with surgical precision, right between the lines of Gerard's self-congratulating smirk. A man who spent his life reciting legal codes but never once had to explain to his daughter why the law didn't always mean justice. Letitia had no patience for the kind of men who believe governance should be elegant, not effective, who see public service as a club, not a duty, who believe power should pass through bloodlines, not ballots. Gerard blinked, chuckled softly, as if her reply was cute, not categorical, but even he couldn't ignore the way Joanne shot him a glare that could melt glass. The party music played on, but the social choreography had changed. Letitia could feel the subtle retreat of a few guests, unsure whether to side with comfort or conscience. She could sense the cocktail of pity and panic bubbling under Camille's carefully Botoxed brow, and she could see Vivienne, still across the patio, still sipping, but now watching Letitia with the intensity of a chess player who suddenly realized her opponent wasn't bluffing. The night had begun with appetizers and idle praise, but now? The real menu was unfolding, and Letitia, with nothing but truth and a steel backbone, was just getting started. It was her party, her garden, her guest list. But Letitia James might as well have been a ghost at her own celebration. With every step she took across her perfectly manicured lawn, conversations wilted like overwatered begonias. Laughter dimmed. Eye contact dodged. Her presence, once the nucleus of the evening, now seemed to repel like a truth too raw for polite company. And no one had to say it out loud. That was the art form. The exclusion wasn't loud, it was choreographed. A ballet of body language, of backs half turned, of smiles that vanished just before reaching the eyes. Letitia had walked through enough elite rooms to recognize the signal. "We see you, we don't want to." From across the patio, Camille's voice floated over like perfume with ammonia undertones. She was talking to a woman whose job, Letitia was willing to bet, involved either wine marketing or bullying interns into designing wellness brochures. "You've noticed," Camille said, lifting her glass, "how colorful the state government's looking these days." "Not that I mind. It's trendy. People are so into inspiration now. You know, stories, grit. Not always talent, but you get the idea." The guest laughed, but the kind of laugh that comes with checking if it's socially safe to do so. Camille beamed as if she'd just received a standing ovation at the Council on Privileged Snideness. Letitia caught the comment, not because she was eavesdropping, but because Camille wanted her to. That's how these people fought, through audible footnotes, through remarks that traveled just far enough to be heard, but not far enough to be confronted. They didn't argue, they editorialized. Minutes later, a younger guest approached Letitia near the buffet, an earnest renter named Michael who'd once emailed her office about a predatory lease renewal. "I read your op-ed on the Tenant Defense Initiative," he said. "What are the chances of the Senate passing the latest protections?" Finally, a question with substance. Letitia launched into a clear, concise explanation. Dates, sponsors, amendment language. She'd spent weeks fighting for this bill. But as she spoke, Vivienne, perched on a wicker chair nearby, didn't look at Letitia's face. She stared at her shoes. Classic black pumps, polished to a mirror finish. When Letitia wrapped up her point, "And if the Assembly Majority Leader doesn't cave to the lobbying bloc, we'll have teeth in the enforcement clause." Vivian offered a slow blink, then murmured, "So much effort. just to help a few renters here and there. Exhausting, isn't it?" Letitia didn't respond. She took a sip of her wine, let the weight settle on her tongue. Sauvignon Blanc, probably a $42 bottle Vivian brought herself, crisp but thin. She let it sit, then glanced upward at the string lights overhead. Warm bulbs looped between the peach tree and the balcony railing, swaying gently like witnesses to a slow betrayal. In that moment, the celebration shifted. The tablecloths and toasts fell away. What remained was a terrain she knew too well, a battlefield with better hors d'oeuvres. This was not new. Letitia had endured this dance for decades. The elegant marginalization, the sterilized contempt. No slurs, just smirks. No chains, just shrinking space. What stung wasn't that they dismissed her. What stung was that they thought she wouldn't notice. As if her years in office, her litigation record, her congressional testimonies, all amounted to an anecdote. One of those interesting exceptions people like Vivian could reference when justifying a donation to an arts program in the Bronx. Letitia wasn't a threat in their eyes. She was a feature, an accessory to their civility. Vivian's sigh was audible. "It's noble, of course," she said to no one in particular, "but also terribly micro-level. Sometimes I wonder if we're wasting brilliant minds on such localized messes." Letitia smiled. Not a grin. Not even satisfaction. Just the upward curve of someone who had heard this refrain too many times to be offended, but not enough to let it pass. She didn't fire back. Not yet. Because power, real power, isn't always loud. It waits. It watches. It lets people dig their own graves with gold-plated teaspoons. The real question wasn't whether Vivienne Moreau thought she was better. Of course she did. The real question, what Letitia was calculating now, was how much longer this party could pretend to be a gathering when it had clearly become a courtroom. And if that was the case, then it was time to call witnesses. Because in a few more remarks, a few more flicks of condescension, Letitia wouldn't be the only one standing trial. The chandelier of pleasantries was cracking, and what lay beneath wasn't just rudeness, it was rot. And Letitia, she was about to rip back the linen. By the time dinner was served, the mood had congealed into something resembling a professionally catered inquisition. The long, cream-draped table stretched across the backyard like a diplomatic front line, candlelight flickering off crystal like bayonets held in polite formation. Letitia was seated precisely where she was meant to be, not at the head of the table, but just central enough to keep her in full view. To her right sat Joanne, the retired teacher with a steel-trap memory and a low tolerance for nonsense. To her left, Dr. Whitman, a silver-haired liberal who liked to remind people he marched with someone's cousin during Selma. And directly across from her, the Moreaus, lined up like a museum exhibit labeled Entitlement in 3 Generations. Vivian sat dead center, her posture so upright it could have been trademarked, her hands folded delicately over a stemmed glass of Chablis. Camille flanked her right, swirling a Bordeaux like she was waiting for a rose ceremony, and on Vivian's left, Gerard smoothed the edges of his linen napkin with the precision of a man who thought wiping barbecue sauce off his cuff was beneath democracy. Vivian began with what she must have believed was a compliment. "It's just so heartening," she said, raising her glass and her chin simultaneously. "To see women like you, from Evanston, was it? Come this far. It's really a testament to the American spirit, don't you think?" Letitia didn't blink. "Absolutely," she replied. "Opportunity doesn't come from zip codes. It comes from refusing to quit." It should have stopped there. But of course, it didn't. Camille, ever the conversational sniper, couldn't resist taking a shot. "Mom," she said with theatrical innocence, "Evanston's got all those diversity pipelines, right? I think I read something about a scholarship initiative, something about expanding representation in leadership spaces." She turned to Letitia, all polished grin and predatory undertone. "Maybe that helped open a few doors for you?" Letitia's fork hovered mid-air. Her expression remained neutral. Too neutral. She didn't answer right away, but in that silence, the clatter of another guest's fork hitting porcelain echoed like a gunshot. And then came Gerard. With the steadiness of a man who believed his every utterance was a contribution to national policy, he leaned forward. "It would make sense," he said, tone low and faux considerate. "Your policy priorities do seem to focus quite heavily on low-income populations. It's noble, of course, but rather emotionally driven, don't you think? Less about systems, more about sentiment." This was the moment where the air chilled, not with wind, but with recognition. Around the table, people who'd previously been swapping recipes or marveling at Letitia's plum cobbler fell quiet. A married couple near the end, both white, both in real estate, exchanged looks, then quietly set their utensils down. The implication was clear. We see what's happening. The question was, would Letitia let it pass? Spoiler, she would not. Letitia set her fork down with the calm precision of someone used to disarming rhetorical grenades. She looked first at Vivian. "I'm from Evanston, yes," she said. "But let's not pretend Evanston is a charitable footnote. It's a community, just like this one, except we build legacies from the ground up, not inheritance papers." Camille opened her mouth, but Letitia moved on, eyes narrowing slightly on Gerard. "As for my policies," she continued, her voice even but charged, "they focus on the people most likely to be crushed beneath the very systems you seem so eager to protect. If that's emotional, then I'd argue the Constitution was written in tears." There it was, the rhetorical table flip, elegant, lethal, delivered with the kind of restraint that made it burn more deeply. Vivian's jaw clenched. Camille blinked, visibly recalculating. Gerard leaned back in his chair, his hands retreating to his lap like soldiers abandoning a post. What made it worse, far worse for them, was that Letitia wasn't angry. She was composed, controlled, and absolutely unwilling to entertain the fiction that their remarks were innocent. She knew the game, and more importantly, she knew they were losing. But she also knew this dinner wasn't over. That was merely the first course. And if the Moreaus thought they could nibble away at her worth with hors d'oeuvres of disdain, they hadn't yet seen what she was serving for the main course. Letitia placed her wineglass down with the deliberateness of a closing argument. Her back straightened, not in defiance, but in precision. No wasted movement, no raised voice, just posture and purpose. The candles flickered slightly, casting her in a glow that made even the flickering string lights above pause for effect. "I don't speak for sentiment," she said. "I speak for 3.4 million New Yorkers the legal system routinely overlooks, and I don't raise my voice because their silence is already loud enough." Her tone was clean, unwavering. She wasn't there to trade jabs. She was there to draw boundaries with surgical force. She shifted her gaze, not with anger, but with surgical detachment, letting her eyes land squarely on Camille like a witness being recalled. "And the scholarship you referred to," Letitia said, her voice lowering slightly, "wasn't a gift from the gods of inclusion. It was earned. Summa cum laude, 3 times over the median entry threshold. I didn't climb through a window. I built a door. Camille blinked. The smirk she usually wore like a boutique accessory faltered. For a brief moment, she resembled something almost human, like a country club chandelier flickering after a power surge. Vivian, never one to leave the last word to someone without a hyphenated family name, cleared her throat with the regal arrogance of someone who once chaired a Women for Heritage Values Committee. "We don't deny your competence," she began, pausing to adjust the silk scarf she wore like an honorary degree in tone policing. "It's just that. We value cohesion, harmony. When one enters institutions built over centuries, like courts, like government, there's a responsibility to blend, not disrupt, to respect the architecture." Letitia turned her head slightly, lips pressed into a line. "Which architecture exactly?" she asked, voice soft as a fuse. "The kind built on exclusion? On legacy hires and nepotistic handshakes? I'm not here to blend into your blueprint, Mrs. Moreau. I'm here to recompose the score." There was no applause. Not yet. Just a series of micro-reactions, eyebrows lifting, chairs shifting, glasses pausing halfway to lips. Dr. Whitman, bless his reliably liberal heart, muttered under his breath, "That's leadership," like he was offering communion. And just like that, the power at the table shifted. Camille crossed her legs the opposite direction, as if that might untangle her from the trap she'd helped set. Vivian tilted her chin upward, a queen sensing her crown had tilted but refusing to acknowledge it. And Gerard? He studied his wine like it had betrayed him. Letitia's words didn't just cut, they redefined the terrain. Her calm wasn't the absence of fire. It was the kind of heat that reshapes steel. She hadn't raised her voice, because she didn't need to. People don't whisper in court. They testify. What made the moment even more unbearable for the Moreaus was that Letitia wasn't pleading for validation. She was announcing her jurisdiction, and they, for once, were the ones out of order. This was no longer about discomfort. This was about exposure. Vivian had hoped for a polite evening, a carefully choreographed display where Letitia played the grateful public servant and they played the benevolent gatekeepers. Instead, Letitia had walked into their tableau and kicked over the easel, not with rage, but with facts, with earned power, with presence. Of course, they didn't say a word about race. They never did. Their racism came lacquered in restraint, served with a twist of concern, garnished with institutional nostalgia. They didn't need slurs. They had standards. And tonight, Letitia had called them by their real names. She wasn't asking to be let in. She was making it clear she already owned a seat, and she'd brought her own chair just in case they forgot. But if the Moreaus were rattled now, they had no idea what the main course would bring. Because Letitia wasn't finished. She'd only just uncorked the bottle, and what came next would test whether anyone at that table had the stomach for truth served without garnish. And then, inevitably, the silk gloves came off, though Camille, to her credit, never wore them particularly well to begin with. Her tone sharpened, volume rising like a wine-fueled confession slipping past the limits of decorum. "I don't have a problem with people of color," she announced, with the confidence of someone convinced that saying the words aloud made them true. "As long as they know their place, it's just the way you speak, Ms. James. It makes people feel accused, like we're all somehow guilty for your journey." The table didn't gasp, it contracted. A full-body cringe rippled across the linen. Forks paused. A cheese knife froze mid-slice. Even the string lights above seemed to dim, as if Brooklyn itself were trying to duck under the awkwardness. Camille had crossed a line, but what made it worse was that she didn't know there'd ever been one. Letitia turned, her expression glacial in temperature, but blistering in effect. "If you feel accused by facts," she said evenly, "you may want to reconsider your position. Perhaps the discomfort isn't coming from me. Perhaps it's coming from the mirror." It was a masterclass in rhetorical restraint. She didn't raise her voice or slam her glass. She didn't have to. Because when you're right, you don't shout. You measure. And Camille, for all her tailored polish, had just found herself intellectually bankrupt at a table she thought she owned. But Gerard couldn't help himself. He leaned forward with the tone of a man about to deliver an unsolicited TED Talk titled, "When Meritocracy Looks Like You." Now, he interjected, hand raised as if keeping racial justice on a leash. "Let's not get heated. What we're saying, Ms. James, is that someone from your background achieving this, well, it's impressive. Quite frankly, astonishing. But let's also be realistic. Knowing one's limitations is part of what keeps society balanced." Letitia smiled. Not sweetly, not even politely. It was the kind of smile you give someone right before handing them the rope they've just requested to hang themselves. "Astonishing," she repeated. "That word, Mr. Moreau, says more about your expectations than it does about my resume. To you, I'm an anomaly, a glitch in a system built for your comfort. But I didn't sneak into power. I was voted in by a majority. I don't sit in someone else's seat. I sit at the head of the table because the people of this state put me there, not despite my background, because of it." Vivienne, who had until now observed the unraveling with the patience of a monarch watching peasants squabble over protocol, chose this moment to swirl her wine glass in slow, judgmental circles. Her voice sliced through the silence like an antique letter opener. "We're simply trying to preserve the values," she said. "The ones that helped this community flourish. Tradition, civility, structure. That's what built strong neighborhoods. That's what's kept them clean, stable, prosperous." It was the kind of sentence that should have been framed in needlepoint and hung next to a portrait of Robert E. Lee sipping a mint julep. Letitia leaned back in her chair, allowing the candlelight to catch the rim of her glass. "Communities don't flourish because they build walls around the familiar," she said. "They flourish because someone dares to knock those walls down. What you call tradition, I call a velvet cage. It keeps certain people comfortable, and others conveniently out of frame." The entire table shifted, not physically, but tectonically. Camille had gone quiet. Gerard's hands now clasped in front of him like a failed chess player watching the endgame unfold. Vivienne blinked, just once. But in her world, that was a flinch. What made Letitia's responses so lethal was that they weren't performative. They weren't for applause, although a few stunned guests gave her just that. They were for history. She wasn't confronting a family. She was confronting an architecture, a belief system lacquered in politeness and passed off as legacy, and she was doing it without breaking a sweat. Meanwhile, the Moreaus sat marinated in their own discomfort, still convinced that civility could somehow out-argue justice, still trying to weaponize phrases like "our values" and "harmony" as if those words had ever protected anyone but themselves. They had expected Letitia to assimilate, to thank them for the scrutiny, to nod graciously when they called her presence inspiring, but only if she didn't speak too loudly or too boldly or too much. And instead, she rewrote the script, but the night wasn't over. Because once the foundation cracks, it's only a matter of time before the whole damn house shifts. And Letitia James? She'd barely gotten started with the demolition. For a long second, no one moved. The kind of stillness that settles after an unexpected punch. Not because it knocked someone out, but because it landed harder than anyone was ready to admit. Camille sat frozen, her cloth napkin crumpled in one hand like she meant to wring justice from it. Vivienne tilted her head slightly, giving Letitia a sideways glance so sharp it could have sliced a roast. Gerard rested his elbow on the table and propped his chin against his knuckles, wearing the pensive expression of a man who suddenly found himself losing a game he hadn't realized he was playing. And then, out of nowhere, came Joanne. She stood. No theatrics, no clinking glass to demand attention. Just her hand placed flat on the table, her voice calm but crisp, like someone delivering a verdict rather than a toast. "I've lived on this street for 37 years, she said, and I've never seen a backyard gathering this thoughtful, this gracious, this welcoming. Her gaze swept across the table, then settled squarely on Letitia. And I've also never seen someone insulted this many times in one sitting without a single person raising a damn fork to call it what it is. The silence cracked. A few heads turned. One man at the end of the table straightened his posture like he'd suddenly remembered his spine. Joanne wasn't done. She turned her eyes toward Vivienne. I've sat beside you at community planning meetings, Vivienne. Years of them. And in all that time, I don't remember you ever asking a single question about affordable housing, or tenant protections, or policing equity. But here you are tonight, scrutinizing the woman who's actually doing something about those things. So tell me, what exactly are your values building, other than this table's discomfort? There it was. The shift. Subtle, but seismic. Vivienne blinked, her hand tightening around the base of her wineglass. For once, she didn't have a line ready. No soft deflection. No, let's not politicize the moment. Just the faint flicker of offense finally meeting resistance. From the other end of the table, a man in his 50s cleared his throat. Richard, owner of the independent bookstore on Court Street, a man known more for his discount bins than his political commentary, leaned forward slightly. I don't know about the scholarship program or why anyone keeps bringing up Evanston like it's code for something, he said, looking around. What I do know is that Letitia helped my mother keep her apartment. She was being evicted by a landlord who accidentally turned off her heat during winter. One phone call to the AG's office got results. That wasn't diversity. That was accountability. His voice wasn't raised, but it rang. Camille shifted uncomfortably, the kind of squirm only people experiencing accountability in real time can perform. Her perfectly arched brow twitched upward, as if realizing for the first time that the room no longer orbited her family's sense of decorum. Vivienne, lips now a tight line, looked around as if taking stock of the room. Who was still with her? Who wasn't? For a woman who prided herself on controlling a conversation with no more than a glance, the silence she now faced was deafening. Letitia didn't speak. She didn't need to. This wasn't about her taking the floor. This was about the floor shifting under those who thought it belonged to them. And Gerard, the man who moments ago lectured Letitia about knowing her limitations, now looked as if someone had just shown him the expiration date on his worldview. He nodded, slowly, eyes lowered, not out of shame, but out of calculation. He was the type who didn't believe he could lose a debate, only that he might lose the audience. What was happening now wasn't a political shift. It was a moral one, the kind of redistribution that doesn't require ballots, only backbone. Letitia's chair didn't move. Her hands stayed folded on the table. But the room had begun to reorient itself around her, not because she demanded it, but because the people who'd been quietly watching had finally decided to speak. Joanne, Richard, and more who hadn't yet raised their voices, but whose silence had changed tone. It no longer sounded like complicity. It sounded like readiness. And that, more than any policy memo or legal argument, was the real threat to the Moreau dynasty, a community that no longer needed permission to think for itself. But this wasn't the conclusion. This was just the opening crack in the dam. Because once one person speaks, others follow, and what spills out next would be far harder to clean up than a spilled glass of wine. For a woman who prized herself on composure, Vivienne Moreau's voice was now wobbling dangerously close to shrill. She set her wineglass down a little too firmly, Chardonnay sloshing against the rim, as if that sound might reassert her authority. "Let's not twist this," she declared, her tone tightening like a corset 2 sizes too small. "No one here has insulted anyone. We're merely asking questions. And if those questions make some of you uncomfortable, perhaps it's your conscience that needs a closer look." Classic. The "if you're offended, that's your fault" maneuver, the last refuge of the socially self-righteous. Vivienne had moved from dog whistling to foghorning, hoping the volume might mask the intent. But this time, someone cut in before she could fully reset the table. Melissa, a 30-something non-profit strategist who'd been politely sipping sangria at the edge of the fray, leaned forward. "With all due respect," she said, always a red flag before a verbal scalping, "you've been asking questions like a judge who's never listened to testimony. That's not dialogue. That's exclusion with better tableware." A few jaws clenched. One of the wine glasses gave a nervous clink as its holder adjusted their grip. Vivienne opened her mouth, but before she could counter with another tone-policed justification for elitist gatekeeping, Camille jumped in, voice raised, eyes wide with performative offense. "Oh, I get it. So now anything a white person says is automatically racist?" It was the rhetorical equivalent of hurling glitter on a crime scene and hoping it counted as evidence. Camille's tone was all indignation and zero insight. A woman so addicted to being centered that the mere redistribution of attention felt like assault. From the side of the table came a sharp male voice. Andre, the quiet software engineer who rarely spoke above 60 decibels, now cutting through the air like a well-aimed code review. "Not everything," he said firmly. "Just the parts where you belittle people, then wrap it in a smile and a Sauvignon Blanc." The room laughed, not a full roar, but the kind of reflexive chuckle that happens when truth catches people by surprise. Camille turned red, her lips pressed so tightly they could have sealed an envelope. Vivienne looked around the table, scanning for allies, and found only silence. Or worse, eye contact laced with discomfort. That's when Martha. Yes, that Martha, the octogenarian who'd lived on the block since Eisenhower was in office and hadn't spoken all night, cleared her throat with the casual menace of a woman who'd seen 3 generations of social climbing nonsense. "If you and your family," she said softly, "can't muster the basic courtesy to behave like guests at someone else's table, then perhaps you shouldn't come at all." And just like that, the weather shifted. You could feel it. The gravitational pull that had once centered around the Moreaus was now orbiting somewhere else entirely. Around Letitia, yes, but more than that, around truth. Around finally saying the things people had been too polite, too scared, or too exhausted to say aloud. Vivian blinked rapidly, the way one does when tears threaten, but pride won't allow them passage. Camille's eyes darted toward her phone, no doubt debating whether to text her husband something along the lines of, "These people are unhinged." And Gerard, who, up to now, had leaned on his old man gravitas like a walking cane, shifted in his chair, suddenly aware that his signature paternal nod had lost its currency. Letitia didn't gloat. She didn't move. She just watched, calm, unmoved, quietly triumphant. This wasn't a speech she needed to give. The crowd was giving it for her. The Moreaus hadn't lost a debate. They'd lost the illusion of being beyond debate. And in that loss, their isolation became uncomfortably visible. But this wasn't the end of the unraveling. The floor was cracking beneath them, and what came next would do more than just rearrange the seating chart. It would redraw the entire blueprint. Letitia stood, not in protest, but in authority. There was no clatter, no performative gesture, just a deliberate rise that made the string lights above seem to straighten their posture in tandem. She didn't need to raise her voice. The silence had already carved the floor for her. She gently rotated the stem of her glass between two fingers, her gaze sweeping across the dinner table like a surgeon about to mark the incision. "I'm not asking to be liked," she said. "I'm asserting a right, the right to be respected, in my own backyard." The words landed with the clean, surgical weight of a gavel. The crowd didn't flinch. They absorbed it, like people suddenly realizing they were no longer guests at a garden party, but witnesses in a reckoning. Letitia held the silence for a beat, then two, then three. "And if my success bothers you," she continued, "if the sight of a black woman from Evanston reaching further than the narrative you wrote for her causes discomfort, then that speaks volumes. Not about me, but about what you expect from people who don't look like you, who didn't inherit your networks or your dinner table etiquette or your presumption of belonging." The sentence didn't end. It detonated. Someone clapped, just once, then again. And then the ripple became a wave. Hands met palms across the table. Not a thunderous standing ovation. Something sharper. Agreement. Not out of politeness, out of relief. Letitia had said what half the table had been tasting in their mouths, but too afraid to spit into the linen napkin. Vivian froze. Her expression tried to play neutrality, but her jaw betrayed her, tightened to the point of lock. She didn't speak, because she couldn't. For a woman who'd built her life on shaping conversations with well-placed glances and coded compliments, this was uncharted terrain. Power had shifted, and no amount of vintage silk could stitch it back. Next to her, Camille looked like a misplaced campaign ad, airbrushed, cornered, and abandoned by the messaging team. She reached for her wine, missed the stem, and gripped it like a lifeline. Gerard, the man who once offered career wisdom with the same tone he used to order dry-aged steak, stood up slowly, not out of indignation, out of inertia. Perhaps we should excuse ourselves," he murmured, each word dragged like a suitcase through customs. "This isn't productive." Letitia turned to him, eyes steady, voice calm. "You're right. It's not productive to stay if you came only to supervise what others have built without you. So yes, Mr. Moreau, maybe you should go." She paused. Let the silence stretch long enough for Vivian to feel the full measure of what hadn't been said aloud. "And if you ever return," she added, "bring a different attitude, one that matches the dignity this neighborhood has shown you, despite what you've shown them." That was it. The closing line. The checkmate. No door slammed, no voices shouted. But their exit was louder than any outburst could have been. The Moreaus rose, awkwardly, slowly, each of them discovering in real time what it meant to be dismissed from a room without being thrown out. It wasn't a scandal. It was a verdict. And Letitia? She didn't sit back down right away. She stood for a moment longer, not to bask in anything, but to let the room settle around a new center of gravity. Her center, not demanded, claimed. What made this moment so powerful wasn't the confrontation. It was the correction, the realignment, the subtle but irreversible rewriting of who this table was for and who no longer got to claim it by default. Because what Letitia just performed wasn't self-defense. It was reclamation, not just of space, but of narrative, of legacy, of power without apology. And as the Moreaus retreated through the back gate, heads stiff, eyes forward, their place at the table didn't sit empty. It simply stopped existing. The Moreau family rose as if gravity had turned against them. No theatrical departure, no final insult, just silence, the kind that follows a verdict. Vivian didn't say goodbye. Gerard didn't offer a handshake. Camille glanced back once, but Letitia met her gaze without flinching. No fury, no pity, just clarity. The look of a woman who wasn't interested in redemption arcs or half-hearted regrets. It wasn't rejection. It was refusal. To let old power keep writing the script. And then, as their carefully curated silhouettes disappeared through the garden gate, something shifted. The table, the yard, the very air, all of it exhaled. Like a room unbuttoning its collar. A release. Letitia didn't bask. She didn't collapse. She simply stood, surrounded now by the quiet rustle of movement. Chairs scraping, glasses lifted, voices returning. But this time with warmth. Not the performative kind polished for optics. Something real. Something earned. Joanne was the first to reach her. She wrapped Letitia in a hug that was part apology, part pride. "Tonight," she whispered, "you didn't just defend yourself. You defended this whole damn street." It wasn't flattery, it was acknowledgement. Of all the times Joanne hadn't spoken up, of all the nods, the silences, the well-meaning neutrality that had too often passed for grace. Tonight, Letitia had pulled the curtain back, and nobody could pretend not to see the stage. Then came Dr. Whitman. The man who once quoted Baldwin at wine tastings now stood a little taller, a little more aware of where he stood. He raised his glass and his voice. "To Letitia," he said, "not just a woman of law, but a woman who demands justice in the places we least expect it and most need it." Glasses clinked, not in toast to performance, but in tribute to courage. For once, the compliments weren't about her resume or her articulation or her impressive journey. They were about impact, consequence, and the fire it takes to burn down polite racism without leaving ash in your own lungs. Music returned. Jazz again, no longer background but celebration. The table grew louder, looser. People leaned in, not out. Jokes landed, laughter flowed. Not because the tension was gone, but because the silence had been broken. The rules had been rewritten. This was no longer Vivian's neighborhood, where inclusion meant smiling while being dissected. This was Letitia's table now. Messy, honest, resilient. She turned to Joanne, lips curling in a quiet smirk. "Funny," she said. "They thought it was a dinner party. Turns out it was a hearing." Joanne cackled, wiping her eyes. "And you were the fiercest prosecutor I've ever seen. No contest." Letitia chuckled too, but only briefly. The weight of what had just transpired still lingered. She wasn't naive. She knew one dinner didn't erase a system. She knew Vivian's ideology didn't vanish with her heels clicking out the gate. But something else had shifted. The community had chosen. And in that choice, the power map had redrawn itself. She looked around at the people gathered. Black, white, Asian, young, old, queer, straight, single moms, retired teachers, tech bros with side gardens. A patchwork that had, for one night, come together not just in defense of one woman, but in rejection of an old order that no longer deserved its seat at the table. Letitia picked up her glass. She didn't raise it. She didn't need to. Instead, she walked back to her chair, her seat reclaimed without permission, and sat, not in triumph, in permanence, because the point had never been just to confront the Moreaus. It was to show that their way of seeing the world wasn't inevitable. It wasn't inherited. It was constructed, and therefore it could be dismantled. And tonight, in one backyard lit by string lights and backbone, it was.